Hello, Sophie. Thank you very much for joining me today on my project called Samtal Jameen, Samtal Jameer, which is translated from Hindi to mean equal terrains, equal selves. And it's a project, as you know, of examining the idea of multi-species worlds and what they might mean and how we think of them. For those of you who are sort of going to be seeing this, Dr. Sophie Chao, whom I first met in Australia in Sydney at a conference in 2019, is at the School of Philosophical and Historical Inquiry in the University of Sydney. She's an anthropologist, but has extensive areas of expertise ranging from environmental anthropology to her work in fantastic work in West Papua. She publishes a periodical newsletter called More Than Human and is deeply engaged both as a scholar, but I think also as an on-the-ground practitioner to understand and to bring out what these relationships, multi-species relationships mean. Her detailed CV is part of this page you can visit. I'm just going to start off directly with asking Sophie that what is this idea of the multi-species world? How should we think about it?
Thank you so much, Ravi, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this vital conversation, vital in more ways than one and more than human. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal country here in Australia, and I want to also pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emergent, and to Gadigal kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. So for me, multi-species worlds is really an optic that invites us to move away from thinking about worlds and world-making practices and world makers purely in human terms. So to sort of start thinking about, other than human beings, plants, animals, elements, climates, atmospheres, elemental forces, as also consequential actors, protagonists, and participants in the production and the generation of always shared and always unevenly shared more than human worlds. So for me, multi-species is as much about multiplying the world across species lines as it is about thickening the human, right? In the sense of trying to understand what it means to be human in different ways, in different places, and at different times, based on particular ecological, cultural, historical, and political kinds of contexts. So I think the multi-species is at once about the species as it is about the human and about all these different situated places and times where humans and other than humans become with one another in different and more or less just or structurally equal ways.
So these are like foundational ideas. They're foundations. You're questioning the very foundations of human society in how we think ourselves in the last few hundred years, have thought of ourselves. But also from your work in West Papua and with indigenous communities, you emphasize that there are many different ways of thinking about what is human. Because we, as people who have grown up in a certain kind of Western idea of the individual, cannot think outside that frame. It's us and the world. But this is not the complete picture. And so if you could just tell us a bit more about what has been your experience, what have been your observations, what would you say that how else can we be in the world where we acknowledge the agency and personhoods of other worlds?
Yeah, that's a big philosophical and political and practical question that you're asking. I think it encompasses those three facets. So yes, you know, for me, so much of what I've learned about multi-species world has been through my incredibly fortunate opportunities to learn from and to think with Indigenous societies in West Papua, who have always entertained intimate and ancestral relationships of kinship with plants, animals, ecosystems, and landscapes. These are societies that are not governed by a strict nature-culture divide. In fact, there is no word for nature and no word for culture among the people that I work with. And that speaks to the fundamental ethos of relationality at the heart of Indigenous Papuan ways of being. That is to say that the human always becomes with or through his or her or their relations to other than human siblings, grandparent species with whom they share common descent from ancestral spirits. So once you start to move away from these strict binaries of nature, culture, human, non-human, body, mind, the list goes on, in the Cartesian sort of tradition, you enter a world that is much more defined by porosity, by fluidity, by mutual relations of capture and care, that demand a different kind of accountability and responsibility and ability to respond on the part of humans towards non-human beings and communities of life. For me, what I learned from these multi-species indigenous philosophies, practices and protocols was an ethos of humility, which I think is also a hallmark of neoliberal individualistic human-centric paradigms, is that they are not particularly conducive to humility. If anything, they are conducive to notions of exceptionalism that have proven highly destructive of planetary health and well-being, and also the health of racialized, marginalized human communities under ongoing regimes of colonial and racial rule. So I think this idea of humility, of rethinking oneself as one among many and becoming as one among many, is an ethos, again, that returns us to ideas of reverence, of respect, of relation, that I think are absolutely vital in forging less violent and more just multi-species futures.
Thank you. That's a lot to, that's a big shift. There's a lot to absorb. And I think that you engage with this on the field as an anthropologist. This is, to me, very exciting because these words have real world, there are worlds around these words, which is hard for me to imagine unless I encounter them or know a bit more about them. But also, as part of this invitation to participate, which I'm, of course, thank you again for doing it, I had sent a bunch of my photographs as triggers for thoughts. And I was wondering if any of them have triggered any trajectory of thought which you'd like to react to or not. So if you do, then please share with us.
Absolutely. And well, thank you so much for sharing this series of photographs that each struck me and triggered different sorts of affects and ideas. And I want to mention affect and ideas because I think both are equally important to rethinking and refeeling our way through the planetary crisis. And as an academic, I do much more thinking than feeling, and I think that balance needs to be corrected. So yes, I've picked a few photographs that spoke to me in light of the research I've been doing in West Papua, but also photographs that spoke to me in relation to broader sort of concepts or paradigms that are becoming central in sort of post-humanist multi-species scholarship in this age of planetary unraveling. So the first photograph that I wanted to speak to is the one titled Captivity. And I might just share my screen. There we go. You might have a larger image of this. I think it's a little bit, but yeah, we can change that later. So this photograph was striking to me at first because I actually there was an opacity of context and subject for me in this photograph, in the sense that when I first looked at it, I hadn't actually read the title of the image, Captivity, and so that left me in a sort of space of epistemic murk, which I think is generative in the sense that it does not foreclose or preclude the kinds of interpretations that this photograph conjures. So for me, there were questions about whether this is a landscape of ruin and desolation or not. Is the grayness of the sky haze and pollution, or is it simply the depth of the monsoonal season? Are these elephants in their native landscapes, or have they been displaced to an exclusive zone of livability? Are these human artifacts I see scattered across the landscape natural? Are they waste? Are they tents? Are they wood fire? Again, there was a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity in the photograph that made me think about the Anthropocene and this age of, environmental destruction itself as a kind of crisis of visibility, literally, but also epistemically, where there is a sense of not knowing what the future holds for humans and for other than human beings, where there is a sense of dislocation or uprooting from a sense of belonging to place, or what some have called solistasia, a melancholia for place-based and place-rooted identities. And there was a strange sort of temporal stasis also, or stagnancy in the image of these still elephants that are all looking in different directions. And what are they looking at or for or with was the big question for me. And the sort of temporal suspension in this image for me really resonated with the kind of notion of the Anthropocene as a time out of joint, where seasons, periods, planetary cycles are increasingly becoming ruptured, severed, and unpredictable. And perhaps this kind of temporal rupture alongside the kind of opacity of what the future holds for elephants, humans, the land, the landscape pictured here, for me really lies at the heart of a lot of the scholarship that I've been engaging with, and a lot of the questions that Indigenous Papuans I am working with are also asking themselves about the future of their worlds and all the many non-human beings that animate and populate it. A second photograph that really grabbed my heart and mind was the one titled Ceremonial. In this photograph, I was particularly caught by the juxtaposition of this beautiful horse and its carer or owner, and the large pipeline infrastructure in the backdrop. And for me, there was a sense of movement, flow, transportation, and mediums going on in this picture. So in the foreground, this horse who has a saddle on its back and therefore transports humans across place for ceremonial or ritual purposes. And in the back, there is this pipeline, and I don't know what it transports or conveys from one place to another. Might it be sewage? Might it be gas? Might it be oil? Might it be some other extracted resource? Again, it's unclear, but there's flow going on in both the foreground and the background. And for me, flows and movements are a big part of the story of the Anthropocene and of multi-species worlds. Flows and movements of people, species, things, ideas, practices, knowledges, but flows that are always uneven in terms of where they're going to, where from, and whose voices and stories are being heard across national and international contexts. So movement and flow, transportation, mediums for communication were part of this picture for me in both infrastructural and animal terms. And then there was also care and empathy and affect and attentiveness in the image of this man who is crouched over this horse. His facial expression is not entirely distinct, but there's something about the posture, both human and animal bowed down, the one to subsist and feed, the other to hold the head of the animal that subsists and finds nourishment, that I thought was really moving and spoke to a sort of connection and intimacy there that operates across species lines, and that perhaps counters what sometimes read as the violence of riding non-human animals, and possibly also using animals as forms of labor, including as vehicles for transportation. A third photograph I wanted to speak to was this one here that you've titled Classification. And this one was powerful for me because the first thing it conjured to my mind was precisely that, classification and the violence of taxonomic ordering and categorization that Western secular scientific paradigms often bring to our understanding of non-human species. That is to say, as names, as labels, as family, species, genera, as taxons, varieties, the whole sort of hierarchies of belonging that Linnaean frameworks slot particular species into, and in ways that can sometimes obscure or flatten their multi-species fleshy stories as living organisms, both in life and in this case in death. So this image for me spoke to the power and violence of classification, but also to the sort of the ethos of salvaging or archiving or collecting that is so much part of Western, museum sort of epistemologies. In anthropology, there was a long tradition of what was called salvage anthropology, which was about recuperating the remains and knowledges and myths of indigenous peoples who are supposedly going to disappear or go extinct in the face of modernity, something which of course has not happened. But this idea of archiving material artifacts was powerful to me because it made me ask myself, in what ways is this remembering nature going to help us remember nature, in the sense of bringing back together all the different members who compose lively, dynamic, reciprocal multi-species worlds, right? How does remembering past species and ecosystems open new ways of thinking forward or looking ahead to emergent ecologies and unexpected contingent sort of flourishings? And then this idea of remains and remnants, as represented by skeletons in this picture, also made me think, about who are we salvaging nature for? Who gets to decide what is worth remembering, naming, and preserving in these, often asepticized spaces that are museums and archives and vaults and so forth? So how do you reconcile the looking back that commemorating and memorializing entails, and again, the looking forward to new life, new biopolitical relations, and less violent necropolitical relations with species at the verge or on the brink of extinction? If I could speak to one more photograph, Ravi, this image here that you titled Extinct. It's really interesting. When I first looked at your photographs, I didn't realize that they had titles, and so I was trying to figure out what the title might be, and this one I had Decay for this image, and it was powerful to me on many different levels. First of all, this is a society, this is a social moment. It is a social fact, as anthropologists would say, about human societies, in the sense that there's a collective of vultures involved in a social activity that is nourishment and subsistence. The vulture, to me, has always been a very powerful icon for distinctly non-charismatic species that in many parts of the world tend to elicit repulsion or fear or some sense of disgust, precisely because they feed on carcasses, on rotting bodies, on putrefying flesh. And yet what I read in the feeding of the vulture is precisely this transformation of decay and rot into life, So this is decay, but this is lively, vital decay. And so it made me think about the need to think beyond life and death binaries or life and non-life binaries, to actually make a space for decay and rot and breakdown also as important elements to sustaining multi-species relations of living and dying, a kind of more ambiguous sort of space where humus, for instance, and putrefaction become sources of lively potency. And another thing that came out from this image, of course, was the fact that, well, first of all, vultures in many parts of the world are now increasingly being driven to the brink of extinction as they're losing their native habitats. But also, many of the carcasses that they are eating are being contaminated with toxins and chemicals and lead and all other sorts of dangerous materials that are filtering through to carcasses from industrial livestock farming and oceanic pollution and soil pollution. So how does that change relationships of living, dying, and decaying when vultures that clean ecologies by consuming the dead are now also in the process consuming deadly substances, toxins, lead, and mercury, and so many others. And for me, that spoke to a concept that the anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose calls double death, which is a death that cannot be channeled into regenerating life, but that actually multiplies death within and across species lines in a way that brings most species to the verge of extinction. So this idea of decay and contamination was so much part of this image for me. And at the same time, as I said, for me, it was an image of, it was a picture, a representation of more than human sociality and collective nourishment.
Thank you. You've sort of breathed new life into the pictures. I'm re-looking at them as listening to you speak. And I mean, the breadth of your scholarship and your experience is hard to capture in a short conversation. But as you were speaking about that image about classification, about which is like extracting nature and then commodifying it in some way, colonizing and commodifying it. I was thinking that how would the people you worked with in West Papua, how would they think of a species which we call it a green civet or whatever? How would they think of the same animal? What stories would be around those animals, which encompass within how they see it the idea of the multi-species world? Because right now we are in a situation where we try and reconstruct the multi-species idea, because the only way we know something is to extract it from everything else. I mean, that's the nature of museums, of collections. And then we try and decolonize it in the current way of saying, okay, so what was where did it come from, in a sense? What happened? But I'm sure in other worlds, what can we learn from them when we think of how they saw or how they see, how other people view this, and probably in equally productive ways of knowing the world, that it's not that a certain kind of notion of scientific classification or knowledge is the only way to know the world, because there's so much we don't know by knowing it in one particular way. And that's also part of the methodology of how we know things. So how would that world look, and how does it look like there?
Thank you for that question, Ravi. When I started my fieldwork in West Papua as a burgeoning anthropologist, I had done a lot of research into the ethnobotanical and ethnozoological classification of native bird, animal, and plant species in West Papua. And so, like a good Western trained anthropologist, the first thing I did when I arrived in West Papua and walked to the forest with my Marin companions was to ask them the names of everything. The plants, the animals, the birds. And, I very quickly realized that my friends were just not interested in what the name was, right? And eventually, as people often do with anthropologists, they lost their temper with me and they asked me, if I tell you my name, what do you actually know about me? And I realized that if someone told me their name, I would only know their name. And so then they started to tell me that species don't exist or matter to them as names or labels. They exist as stories, charitra in their language. So what makes a species that exists meaningfully as a story different to a species that exists meaningfully as a name? Well, stories are always multi-species for Marind, in the sense that you cannot tell the story of one particular sago palm that's in front of me here without also telling the story of the cassowary. That then becomes a story of the wild pig, that becomes the story of the river, that becomes the story of the ocean, that becomes the story of the forest, that becomes the story of the human, that becomes a story of the ancestors. So any particular organism is always this incredibly rich crystallization of multi-species and indeed more than secular stories, because ancestors, spirits, are also part of this narrative that literally gives flesh to that particular organism. So I think thinking about species as stories is a much more capacious, relational and inclusive way of thinking about organisms. And by the same token, it also means that when we think about species as categories, then we end up with a very particular understanding of extinction, right? It is the loss of one particular category of life that exists in a sort of bounded kind of way. But once you start to think about extinction as species, then the death of every organism is also the death of another organism and another element and another ecosystem and all the past, present, and future human generations also that will live differently because of the absence of that particular organism, right? So everything feeds into each other in a way that actually makes extinction a much more everyday and I would say consequential reality, because it's happening all around you, even in the absence of numbers or figures or statistics to tell you that any particular species is definitely gone and never to return. And that, I think, breeds a different kind of ethos or kind of response to relationships of living and dying. But for me, certainly, this idea of thinking about species as stories not only came with the imperative to think relationally, but it also came with the imperative to write relationally. And that has always been very tricky to me, because the partial connections that make a story meaningful are never ending, right? You can keep tracing these capillaries of life and interactions to no end. So the question there is, when do you stop? Where does your story, where do you draw a boundary, given that everything is interconnected and that by that same token, my life, your life, is also interconnected and implicated with that of a cassowary somewhere in the rainforest, Papua New Guinea, because of the airs, waters, and atmospheres that always connect us in different ways.
And then what happens today? How do these stories survive today with everything descending, the whole capitalist extractive mind frame descending on them from all around? It's almost, when I think of this, I think of how climate change is bringing up all the oceans. It's coming from around them, not from them, and they become
Yeah.
the this is what, it's not only they lose this, it's we as humanity, as a planet, lose these centuries of ways of knowing things. So how do they cope with this? What is the interaction with the world outside?
Hmm. Yeah. So Marind, the peoples I've been working with, and the last decade particularly, have seen their environments and relations to the environment radically undermined, primarily by large-scale deforestation and monocrop oil palm plantation development. Indonesia is the world's top palm oil producing country, and it's also where biodiversity loss, mass deforestation, and ongoing indigenous dispossession are rife. And so, yes, of course, that has posed, huge challenges to marin ways of knowing the forest and marin ways of transmitting valued forest knowledge to their progenies. A lot of the time, these knowledges are transmitted orally in the form of stories, myths, and also song. And there is an extensive body of what I would call indigenous science about the forest within these stories and songs that are so often dismissed by the government and corporations as sort of superstition or custom or tradition, right? No, this is indigenous science, because what these stories tell is precisely the ecological relationships of different organisms to each other in ways that can maintain that are sustainable and reciprocal. Marin are also, like indigenous peoples the world over, incredibly resilient, creative, and resisting these techno-capitalist colonial forces that are being imposed on them. And I do want to say that because I'm very aware of the risk of anthropologists like myself doing what the Anangak scholar Eve Tuck calls damage-centered research. That is to say, research that only talks about the loss, destruction, erosion that is happening in indigenous societies the world over, because just as important as that are practices of everyday survivance, continuance, and resilience that are also very much part of the indigenous self-determination and sovereignty struggle and movement across the world. So Marind are using all kinds of experimental, creative ways to continue transmitting their traditional ecological knowledge. Some of them are doing this by making films, so recording their journeys through the landscape and their stories as sort of archives for future generations to come. Others are using aerial drone footage also to map the landscape, and often accompanied by oral narratives and songs that explain what one perceives in this footage. Many of them are also producing 3D maps together with extensive protocols and descriptions, again, of the ways in which the forest feeds, sustains, and nourishes humans and other than humans. So all of these sort of, creative engagements with modern technologies, I think very much testify to this ability of people like Marind to adapt, as indigenous peoples always have, to changing circumstances. But I think, certainly, there's now also a clear rural-urban divide happening also among Papuan societies, where generations living in the cities, don't have that kind of intimate everyday encounter and relationship with the forest in the way that their parents and grandparents did. And that is changing the landscape in terms of the kinds of knowledges that these individuals value, the kinds of futures that they want for themselves and their children, and the kinds of forms of social mobility and upward movement that they are increasingly seeing as desirable as part of these broader kind of capitalist, consumerist transformations happening.
I often think that there is a different kind of personhood, different way you think of your own self. And I'm also come from a person living in India and with a cultural background of different kinds of selves, who we are in the world. And I often think, is it almost an ontological idea through which you embody the stories, through which you embody the world you see? Because as they say that the world you see is the world you create. The world you think of is the world we create. So this is like an expression of a world, of an inner world, which is then expressed through culture and through systems of life, of relationships, and also of family. Who would you consider family? Just your progeny or the world around you, the species you have? Like in India, there is this idea of livestock living with the family in the Himalayas. Some scholars have written about that. So the family is an extended idea of what the world consists of, in a sense, and they have the same kind of feelings towards the non or more than human. it's not just the human. So
Mm.
do you think that it is as fundamental as that? It's almost like an ontological idea of who we are, who I am.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with you that we are talking here about ontological claims to questions of what is a world, what counts as a world, and who gets to count in what world, right? And the reason why I think it's really important, as you are saying, to frame these, realities in ontological terms, is that so often, you've got ontological realities and then you've got epistemology, right? Ways of
Right.
being and ways of knowing. And the big problem happens when, indigenous ways of being are understood by outsiders as ways of knowing that are different, right? So this idea that there is one world, that secular science knows what that world is, and that if particular human communities understand the world differently, it's simply because they represent it differently, not because the world is inherently different,
Right.
but that people have a different perspective, right? So it's a difference between, Viveros de Castro, an anthropologist, says it's a difference between a worldview and worlds of vision, right? Or it's that representation versus ontology kind of distinction. So I think taking seriously the possibility of multiple worlds, of people, of each and every one of us inhabiting a world of many worlds, is really, really key here, because it moves us away from a sort of singularizing, flattening, dominant paradigm of one world towards an openness to the possibility of worlds otherwise. Even if, I don't necessarily believe that a cassowary I encounter in the forest is a sibling of my sister, even if I don't necessarily believe that a spirit inhabits the sago palm at the foot of which my sister's child is sleeping, it's about remaining opening to the possibility of that ontological reality. And I think that brings us back to humility, this sort of, idea of, having the humility to accept unknowability, to accept ways of knowing and being that lie completely outside our habitus and expectations. And that's risky, it's challenging, and therefore I think it's vital. Questioning what counts as a world, who gets to make what worlds, and to look particularly at the places where different worlds rub up against each other, right? Capitalism is a world. Capitalism tells itself its own stories. We tell ourselves the stories we want to hear sometimes, right? So, colonialization is a world. So what happens when these different worlds intersect, collide, clash, come into friction? Those I find are the most generative spaces, and also the places where indigenous peoples, like Papuans that I have been working with, are forging really creative experimental ways of navigating in a nomadic mode across different ways of being and different ways of knowing.
Yeah. Sophie, you are more than an academic, as I said in the beginning, but you also are, you produce this more than a human newsletter, which I find so unusual because A, it takes a lot of energy to do that, a lot of commitment to the idea. So, and you're also speaking to a world which is not necessarily an academic world. It is to the world outside, to people like me. I'm a recipient of your newsletter, and I find it very rewarding to engage with it. So, what is your hope with this? Because uh, what do you hope can happen through knowing this differently, through spreading this idea, to countering this big sort of uh, waterfalls, these concrete structures of capitalistic ideas of who we become, where we can't think of climate change outside of the idea of geoengineering. We're in this big structures of something where we lose agency to do something. So, what kind of agency do you hope to produce? What kind of change do you hope to produce? Because it is the questions you're asking are not just academic questions; they're questions of deep belief and uh, of inquiry, which is very sort of deep belief from personal, almost personal inquiries into the world. And I think your research also, I was always struck by the passion of your research, the involvement of what you're doing.
Thank you, Ravi. That means a huge deal coming from you. And yes, I think I definitely am passionate about the questions that we've been talking about today, because I think I refuse to give up hope. And I'm working with Indigenous peoples who have experienced a century of dispossession, displacement, and disempowerment, and they refuse to give up hope. So if they will not refuse hope, then who am I to give up on the possibility of an otherwise? And so I want to acknowledge that passion comes from the people whom I've had the privilege to work with and to learn from, at great risk to their persons as well, I should say, in the context of West Papua. So yes, the More Than Human World website, I first of all, I called it More Than Human Worlds, not sophiechow.com, because my hope is that it is not about me per se, but rather that the website acts as a platform for interdisciplinary and applied conversations and dialogue across different fields, but also with activists and artists and practitioners who all share in common an interest in changing human-environment relations in this age of planetary unmaking. And so, what I hope can come out of it, I suppose I should distinguish the sort of real world and intellectual outcomes, although of course they are very interlinked. I want to distinguish them because I would certainly not claim to be affecting, structural changes in the world. I hope this can be a stepping stone towards that. But simply by virtue of bringing voices and knowledges from across different disciplines, I think is a really important starting point for rethinking what we understand by the environment, what we understand by a species, as we've been talking about today, and what we see as a just future. And I know you've written about multi-species justice, and that's a particular optic that I'm interested in exploring. And so bringing together different fields is challenging, because we all come at it from slightly different epistemic groundings, but it's also the best way to try to figure out where we can find a common ground. A common territory, perhaps, across the multiple selves that we are. So that's been one of the big aims, is to enable interdisciplinary cross-pollinations about multi-species worlds in the sort of academic and in the practical applied sphere. The other hope that I have from the series is that as you will have gleaned, a lot of my interviewees are early career and global South academics, PhD students or lecturers in universities in the Pacific, and that for me is really, really important. I mean, it sounds so obvious that I would interview Pacific scholars given I work on the Pacific, but unfortunately there is a very dominant global North sort of monopoly over academic knowledge production, and particularly over theory, I would say. This sort of really prevailing sort of framing of ethnography happens in the global South, and then theory happens in the global North and for the global North. So what I'm trying to do by trying to really push away from that paradigm is to try to put into practice a tentative step towards decolonizing intellectual approaches to the environment, right? By, again, looking for theory in the places where fieldwork happens, and looking for theory among the people who are themselves parts of the world that they are describing. And that for me is absolutely critical. I come from anthropology, a discipline that was born of and from and with and through colonialism. So I'm acutely aware of the legacies and the origins of my own field. And so one important hope or attempt through this website and its conversations is precisely to foreground, to showcase, to amplify the voices and ideas and aspirations of global South scholars and practitioners.
Just if I may, one more question about, I mean, I can talk to you for a long time, but about this idea of environment, of multi-species justice. And I often think of the communities of practice or livelihood whom I've worked with here, like fishers, etc., for whom there is embodiment of an ecosystem that, as we talked about, that that they relate to an ecosystem, and extracting is also extraction of need and not extraction for greed, if I may
Mm.
use the word like that. But how these are also linked to environmental justice issues, because these are also the least visible. Like the more than human or non-human worlds become even less visible in our political eye. They are submerged. We don't think of them. They just sort of uh, don't even exist on policy papers or treaties, uh, uh, even less so than the vulnerable and marginalized, increasingly marginal people, or people who are living on the main, from the what we call the mainstream, the margins of them. There's a somehow a link between these two communities who live on the ground, live with ecosystems, and then uh, the idea of agency. That, and I often think of agency as something which is linked with the idea of environmental justice and multi-species justice, agencies and personhood. And so I think it is such a, uh, at one level, it's such a radical shift into the world as I see it right now. Another level, we have several examples, especially in the global south. And this question comes from because you talked about the global south, and I was one of the people I interviewed very early on. I'm so sort of such an honor to do that. But there is people in the global south. There are cultures in the global south which are not, which are living cultures still. There are communities which are still live these ideas. Of course, they are fast decimating, and they're fast getting into what you said, into other modes, going away from their livelihood uh, thinking and livelihood engagements, because they're shifting into mainstream, work industry, etc. But we don't have to always think of these as other and far away. These are already here amongst us. I'm sure in Australia also, they amongst us. If we only have the humility to accept, and the need to engage, and need almost the uh, it's more than a need. It is imperative of engagement, I think, right now.
Yeah.
So do you think that through, with people like you who are working on the field, and then bringing the awareness both academically as well as otherwise, talking to people like me, like on this conversation, there is a possibility that we might shift? Or is it really, what is your sense of what kind of community do we need to create in a larger international level to be able to shift this, to shift this whole thing, that becomes something more than just a fleeting ideas, or but essential ideas for future sustainability of the planet, and uh, uh, humility, but humility, imperativeness of humility, not because of an ethical value, but because there's no other way to survive,
Yes. Yes.
because we are destroying the
Absolutely.
planet, kind of.
Yeah, yeah, I think I mean that's a lifetime's worth of thinking that you've offered me there in that question. But listen, I think you're right, and I think it's an imperative, and this is why I've been increasingly interested in thinking about multi-species justice. For the longest of time, care was the primary optic through which I would think about human-environment relations, and then I realized that justice actually demands something more of us, because I shouldn't have to care for a species or a plant in order to treat it in a just way, right?
Right.
Care, justice actually asks a lot more of us in terms of accountability. And I like that. I think we need to be made more accountable to non-human beings, even if they're non-charismatic, even if they might be dangerous, and even if we have relationships that are violent with them. And Radhika Govindrajan, who maybe you were hinting at
Yes,
earlier
I
in her
was.
book,
Yes.
animal intimacies, makes the fantastic point that multi-species relations are vital, but they are also often decidedly uninnocent, right? So we shouldn't also try to, romanticizing is not the way forward. We need to look at the situated ways in which violence and care are part of these relations. So I think that's why I like justice. It's more demanding, but it's also more slippery as well, because legal understandings of justice, everyday justice, political understandings of justice, affect as a justice. It's very plural, which is
a
good.
complicated term in itself, justice.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
It's very slippery. I'd like to describe it like slippery. Every time I think I know what I'm talking about, it sort of escapes from me like a slippery eel.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think what we need, I mean, as a sort of a multi-species global democracy sort of model, I think for me one of the the global south, global north distinction is again so relevant here, and also your earlier points about the fishing communities that you work with, is that one of the risks I see with environmental protection initiatives like conservation, for instance, right, national parks, is that they end up replicating and perpetuating discrimination towards human communities who are not the drivers of large-scale planetary destruction, who actually entertain often very sustainable and logical sort of relationships with their subsistence ecologies, but who once again often tend to be criminalized or marginalized in some form or another when a government or transnational body decides that conservation is the way forward. So I think that danger of once again sort of replicating intra-human forms of discrimination is one of the big risks, and perhaps also a risk of thinking about multi-species justice. So, and I'm sure you have a lot to say about that. So, attending to human difference alongside special and ecosystemic difference, I think, is absolutely key. That means thinking through intersectional vectors like race, gender, ethnicity, religion, class, rural and urban divides. It is not to say that one justice is more or less important than another. If anything, I think that it's precisely the coming together of all movements for justice that are pushing against domination, mastery, control, and discipline, which I'd say are kind of the hallmarks of both human sources of violence and environmental forms of violence, is really, really important to avoid, again, a global north driven model of justice for humans and non-humans. And, I work with palm oil plantations, which, palm oil is the world's most ubiquitous vegetable oil. It's present in over half of all goods on the supermarket shelves. So yes, where I study is an out of the way shadow place of capitalism, in Val Plumwood's words. But all of us are actually implicated or connected through the materiality of palm oil to these plantations in rural West Papua, right? There is no purity in this world. There is no innocence. And I think that's the kind of reckoning that's important, that there is no moral high ground, and perhaps that is where the humility, the humility-centric understanding of the self, of the territory, of the planet can really, really be important. And in that sense, I think it's as much Indigenous societies and global source societies that have that must have a voice at the table, as it is also global North youth, who I would say are acutely aware of climate change, and who actually really care about what is happening to their planet and what will happen to their lives. And I think it's that chorus of voices, finding alliances, forging alliances across global north-south divides, that I think is absolutely critical. But it's a long-term endeavor, but at the same time, we're running out of time.
Yeah. Well, there is no innocence, there is no purity and humility. These are sort of wise, very wise words, Sophie. These are sort of, to me, they speak a lot to me about what the attitudinal changes we need inside us to sort of inhabit these ideas, these complex ideas, but they own them in a sense. They own the world differently than what we have done. So unless you have any more words you want to add from this, I'm reluctantly will have to, I'm aware of the time and your time and your generosity in giving it to me. If you'd like to say something else at the end.
Now, I just want to say I feel revived from having shared my thoughts and being in conversation with you. And it just shows how much connection and sharing and conversation is so much part of forging new worlds otherwise and more wisely. So I just want to say thank you for that opportunity. And I hope
So
it's the
that's a
beginning of many more flourishings.
mutual thank you, so be it, and we shall be in touch. Thank you so much, Sophie. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ravi. Take
Bye
care.
bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.